Happy Monday, Algebra 1. We are going to continue factoring. Today we are going to combine two factoring methods that we've learned. So we're going to factor with GCF and using the X method. Okay, today we'll focus on problems that only have the same signs. Tomorrow we'll work on problems with different signs. To do this, the steps are pretty easy to list out. First, you have to factor out the GCF. That part has to be done first. You cannot move on to step 2 until you've done step 1. So after we have factored out the GCF, we will factor using the X method, which is what we were doing last week. So let's just jump into our 6 examples. For example 1, our first goal is to factor out our GCF. Now, this one's pretty straightforward. Remember, to find a GCF, you have to think about what every single term has in common. We had done this before by making our lists and finding all of our pairs to find our GCF, but you might not necessarily need to do that anymore. That was the goal, was that eventually we could see the GCF without making our lists. So hopefully you can see that each of these can be divided by 2. We cannot include an X in that because this last term doesn't have an X to give. Remember, we've got to keep it equal for everybody. After we've found the GCF, remember the GCF also goes outside some parentheses, and we put our leftovers on the inside. So what's left over? Well, for our first term, those 2's would cancel out or reduce to 1, so we have 1x squared plus 28x divided by 2 would be 14x plus 98 divided by 2 is 49. Now we can do our X method. So I'll make a little space up at the top to be able to show my X. So my X, we're still just focusing on what's inside of these parentheses here. So we're multiplying to 49. We are adding to 14. Okay, when we do that, the two numbers that are going to multiply to 49 and add to 14 would be 7 and 7. So that's what's going to help us fill in our answer. The 2 that we factored out, that has to stay as part of our answer. Okay, so then we would have x plus 7 and x plus 7. That would be our final answer. So your answers on these problems are going to look like GCF and then your 2 sets of parentheses. So this is what your answers will generally look like. You have to have the GCF on the outside. You can't just leave it off. Remember, the goal of factoring is to write it as a multiplication problem. So if I were to multiply all of this back together, I would get the original problem. All right, let's try number 2. Again, I think you can see that all of these can be divided by 2. They're all even numbers. But this time they also are going to have x's in common. So remember that you can factor out as many x's as they can all give up at the same time. How many do you think that would be? Hopefully you're saying x squared. It's limited by this last term here. This one only has 2 x's to give up. So if they all have to give the same amount, that's as much as they can each give. When we factor out a GCF, our GCF goes outside our parentheses and we put our leftovers on the inside. Again, here the 2's are going to reduce or cancel out. X to the 4th divided by x squared. When we divide the same base, we subtract our exponents. So we get x squared. 22 divided by 2 is 11. Again, subtract your exponents, you would get x to the 1st, or just x. On the end, the x squareds cancel out completely, and 56 divided by 2 gives us 28. Okay, we factored out our GCF, so step 1 is done. I already know that to write my answer, I'm going to need my GCF and 2 sets of parentheses. To figure out what I put in those parentheses, I'm going to use the X method with what I have from my leftovers. Okay, so we are going to try to find 2 numbers that multiply to 28 and add up to 11. Remember, you can use that yellow factor sheet that I handed out while we were still at school to help you out with this. If you look at your factors of 28, 1 times 28, 2 times 14, 3 doesn't work, 4 times 7. So which of those pairs adds up to 11? It would be 4 and 7. So x plus 4 and x plus 7 fill in the rest of my answer. All right, if you have questions, please make sure you write them down and email them to me. I've been getting a couple questions, but not a lot. So hopefully that means this is going well, but if you're not getting questions right on your homework assignment, you need to be emailing me about those. All right, let's move on to 3 and 4. Again, if you need to make your lists in order to find your GCF, technically that's fine. Okay, so 9 would break into 3 times 3. 54 would break into 2 times 3 times 3 times 3. 72 would be 2 times 2 times 2 times 3 times 3. Okay, remember when we did this? And then we look for our matches. So on these lists, we've got 3's in common and another set of 3's in common. So our GCF here is going to be 9. Again, we cannot use an X because not every term has an X. All right, so when we factor that out, it goes outside our parentheses. Whatever is left over goes inside. The 9's cancel out, leaving us with x squared minus 54 divided by 9 is 6. Still an x with that. 72 divided by 9 is 8. Again, in order to continue factoring it, we are going to use the X method. We are trying to multiply to 8, but we are trying to add up to a negative 6. Remember, in order to multiply to a positive number, you need to have the same signs. So either both positive or both negative. If we're trying to add up to a negative, both of our numbers this time will be negative. So we are going to have negative 4 and negative 2 as our factors that would multiply to positive 8 and add to negative 6. So x minus 4, x minus 2. Last week I did have someone email me a question about if it mattered kind of what order you put your factors in. No, it doesn't matter. You could put it either way. These are considered to be the same answer, these two rows. All right, let's do number 4 together. Number 4 is a little bit tricky. If you really wanted to put a number in front of the x to the 4th, what would it have to be? It would need to be a 1. So there's nothing numerically that we could divide all of these by. But we can factor out a GCF. It only involves a variable. So these can all be divided by the biggest power of x that they all have in common, which would be x squared. When we do that, our GCF goes outside some parentheses. We'll put our leftovers on the inside. So x to the 4th divided by x squared, we subtract our exponents. We get x squared minus the 15 staying the same. 15 over 1, still just 15. X cubed divided by x squared is x. Plus 56 because the x squared's canceled out. All right, next we know that we need to factor further into 2 sets of parentheses with our GCF still on the outside. So when we look at our x, when you make your x, make sure you're using the numbers from inside your leftovers. It's not going to work if you try to use the numbers from before the GCF was pulled out. All right, we're trying to multiply to 56, trying to add to a negative 15. So look at your list for 56. Remember to multiply to a positive. You need to have the same signs. In this case, they will both be negative since they need to add up to a negative. Hopefully you identified negative 7 and negative 8 as the pair that will multiply to positive 56 and add to negative 15. So we have x minus 7, x minus 8. All right, write down any questions, concerns. Go ahead and try these 2 problems. You might want to pause the video. I will work them out and put solutions up. I'm not going to talk through it one step at a time like I did the last ones. But I will write out the solutions and you can check yourself. So pause it here to give these 2 problems a try. All right, here's my solution to number 5. Okay, so our GCF was 3x squared. Notice that the GCF still stays out front. If you forget to write your GCF out in the front, then it's not going to be correct. It's got to go out there. And then our 2 factors. Again, they're both negative because we needed to multiply to a positive but add up to a negative. All right, pause it again and we will talk about example 6 in just a minute. All right, we've got our answer to number 6. Our GCF was 6. We factored that out. We got our leftovers. Then we factor our leftovers with the x method. Okay, when we do that, we're multiplying to 18, adding up to 11. So those numbers, magic numbers, would be 2 and 9. So that helps us fill in the rest of our final answer. All right, so on the next slide, I'm just going to recap a little bit here with some just bullet points. We'll just... All right, so here are a few important notes just to recap. Factor out the GCF first, then use the X method to factor just the leftovers. Your final answer should have your GCF and then your 2 sets of parentheses. If your initial problem has a plus sign then another plus sign, your answer will have 2 plus signs. If your initial problem has a minus sign in the middle, then a plus sign towards the end, then your answer will have 2 minus signs, because then we're multiplying to a positive, but adding them up to a negative. If you have questions, please send them to me. I'll let you get going on your assignment for today. Like last week, do the problems from the PDF worksheet and submit your answers via the Google form.